Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In today's special episode, we sat down with Captain Jim Fanell, former Director of Intelligence and Information Operations for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He touches on the rising trade deals and cooperation between China and Brazil, how that impacts America, and where things are headed going forward. Jim, thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks for the invitation, Tiffany. Appreciate it.
Right now, there's a lot of talks of kind of rising trade and cooperation between Brazil and China. And so what are some of the implications that might have for the U.S.?
Well, over the last 25 years, China has been, as we all been watching, growing phenomenally as an economic and military power around the world. And for the most part, especially under General Secretary Xi Jinping, they announced this One Belt, One Road initiative, or the Belt and Road Initiative that they call it. And so we saw China expand its economic and military interests, through the South China Sea and out through the Indian Ocean and into the Mediterranean and into Europe via sea lanes. They've done the same thing essentially through rail lines across Central Asia and into Eastern Europe and now Central Europe and Western Europe. And they've also now been making pushes out into the South Pacific. But what we haven't really focused on, I think the Americans ourselves, is looking at what China's been doing in Latin America. And over the course of the last 18 years, trade between China and Latin America has gone up and up and up dramatically. And in 2021, there was $450 billion worth of trade, almost $500 billion worth of trade between China and Latin America. And so from an economic standpoint, China has really enlarged its position there. Now, the United States is still the largest overall trade partner with Latin America writ large, but China is now the largest trade partner with South America alone. And so that should cause some alarm. And in fact, last year, the former commander of the U.S. Southern Command, Admiral Craig Fowler, talked about the United States losing its positional advantage in the hemisphere, the Western hemisphere. And so China has been kind of quietly under the radar, been moving in and making economic inroads to, get access to natural resources, like in the case of Brazil with coal. That's very important to fueling China's economy and fueling China's people in the winters. And so Brazil and other nations in South America want to sell coal and things of that nature and other kinds of lithium and other elements that will help China's economy continue to grow. And so these trade relationships are really important. There's also a diplomatic side to this. Obviously, China has been trying to isolate Taiwan and diplomatically. And so what we've seen is a number of nations, especially in the last 8 years under Xi, diplomatically work with their wolf warrior diplomats to essentially get different nations in South America to change their recognition from, recognizing Taiwan to recognizing Beijing. And so that's another aspect of this. And then I think in the third aspect is in the military arena, which hasn't been a lot to date, but China has sent and uses their military in the region. I recall when I was on active duty, I think in 2014 or 2015, there was 1 or 2 years there where Chinese naval warships made more port calls in South America than the United States Navy. And so this is, a trend line that we should be watching. Also, China is pushing their fishing fleets into the South America waters. We've heard about, in the last couple of years, about Chinese fishing fleets, 300 ships off the west coast into the Galapagos of Ecuador. But there's also been reports of, conflicts between Argentinian fishermen and Chinese fishermen and Brazilian, where they've been in conflict, open conflict at sea, as Chinese fishing fleets are poaching, stealing resources from these nations in South America from their fishing fleets. And then finally, and what that means is, in order to protect those fishing fleets, you'll probably see, like what you've seen in the South China Sea and what we're starting to see in the South Pacific, is the Chinese, maritime militia, Chinese Coast Guard. They're being built up, and they're not going to stay just in the local waters of the first island chain, but they're going to probably go out and help support and defend any of their interests with the fishing fleets that could go off to into the Atlantic, the South Atlantic, or onto the Pacific side of South America. And so we saw that, I think, in the Galapagos, that there were some vessels that could be termed maritime militia. And what would come next, the next step would be to see PLA Navy warships, gray hulls, that would come out if the conflicts got any more contentious. And so I think that's something that we need to be watching out for as well. And then finally, China has been sending oceanographic research ships to the South Atlantic for the last 10 years. And those kind of ships are doing essentially surveys and mapping of the bottom of the ocean to understand what the sea looks like underneath the sea, and so that you can have a roadmap, if you will. And that's usually a precursor for submarine operations.
And so for the average American who might think, these countries are far away, it has nothing to do with them, what would the effects of a Chinese growing power there be to them?
Well, I think it's just a matter right now of China's growing their power, across all these. It's like the tentacles of an octopus. It's enveloping the world right now. And so when Americans say it doesn't matter to me because it's far away, well, it's far away today, but it won't be far away in the future. And what we're seeing over the last decade in the South China Sea and the building of 7 artificial islands, 3 of which are the size of Pearl Harbor, major naval air stations, 10,000-foot long runways on 3 of these islands, the increased presence of the Chinese Navy in a water that controls, $5 trillion worth of goods that flow through there on an annual basis. That does have an impact on Americans' lives today. And we're seeing China's economy when, for instance, Shanghai is being locked down right now. What are the implications, not long term, but the immediate implications for Americans about what they can buy and sell and what's available? And in terms of not just food, but what about medical supplies? Since a lot of our medical equipment and medical medicine, raw medicine, comes from China. What happens when that supply system gets disrupted? Well, the same thing applies to Latin America. There are certain things that we get and depend upon from Latin America and that they depend upon from us. And if that's disrupted, it will have an impact on Americans' lives. So this idea that we can live in a kind of a isolationist view and sit inside the continental United States and not worry about what happens around the world, it's just not something that I believe in. I don't think most people that are involved with national security issues do. It's just to the extent of how much we can get involved and can we be spread so thin around the world. And part of that is, yes, we will be spread thin, and that requires us to invest more in those kinds of systems and militaries and things of that nature that allow us to show a deterrent to China. Because right now we're in an existential debate, or there's an existential threat to the world from the Chinese Communist Party. And there's a lot of people that are saying, well, we just can't compete. We can't outproduce China. We can't outspend them. We can't build more ships or aircraft, or we can't have more economic relationships because they're so much bigger. I don't know if that's a true statement when people of like-mindedness stand together. China's got 1.4 billion people, but if the United States stands with the rest of Asia, if the United States stands with Latin America, if the United States stands with Europe and Japan and those countries, then there's more people than China. And if they believe in a certain idea of democracy and freedom and individual liberty and these principles that founded America but are universal, if we stand for those with these other partners, then we can negate the effects of the Chinese Communist Party's influence. Because China is going to take resources from South America and they're going to exploit that to their benefit. It's going to make South America poor in the long run, and it's going to manipulate their own natural resources and put them in potentially into this debt trap kind of mindset that we've seen play out in other areas where the Belt and Road has gone. So I think it's a long-term issue in some sense, but it's a near-term issue right now in what's happening, and we have to take action. And so the regular Americans at home need to understand that they need to be supportive of the principles that founded our nation, and we can't be passive and allow China just to go in and, I talk sometimes about the game of Go or WeChat, and China's putting their stones around the world, and they're putting them in positions in key areas so that when the time is right, a lot of other stones will turn to their color, to their side. And we're not playing right now. We're kind of playing checkers while they're playing Wei Qi.
Jim, thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. I appreciate it.
That was Captain Jim Fanell, former Director of Intelligence and Information Operations for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. And for those watching our full episode, joining us after the break, Brent Johnson, CEO of Santiago Capital. Is the U.S. at risk of losing the status as the world's reserve currency? That and more after the break here on China in Focus.